So the topic for this week is inference and argument, and here we are getting right into the essential elements of critical thinking, which really are the relations between ideas, in virtue of which we are able to draw inferences, or we'll say, follow a train of thought where it leads, as they say, right? And the whole idea is to be able to follow it where it leads and don't get lost and end up following somewhere where it doesn't lead. So, to get an idea of what an inference is, what we mean by inference, and I think most people understand that, but just to clarify it, we'll give this short story or example. Let's say one night you and a friend decide over the phone to visit your neighbor, Amr, before he leaves for a long trip. But you don't know if Amr is still home or if he already left. You look across the street and see that the lights are on at Amr's house. So you tell your friend that he is still home. In that case, you made an inference from the fact that the lights are on at Amr's house to the belief that Amr is still home. So here's our inference. Right? A is the lights are on at Amr's house. B is that Amr is home. And when you see that the proposition A is true, it leads you to believe that the proposition B is true. And again, notice that both of these are propositions, right? So really an inference is to believe that one proposition is true on the basis of the fact that you already believe or perhaps know that another proposition is true. In that case, A is the evidence from which you infer B, right? The proposition A expresses the evidence on the basis of which you believe that proposition B is true. Inferences happen in our thoughts, and many times we don't even think about them when they're happening. That is, we often think without thinking about what we are thinking. Yet, to think critically, which is our goal here, we have to think about what we are thinking and why. We have to try to be clear to ourselves about what is leading us to think the things that we're thinking, so that we can evaluate them in an effective way, right? All right, so you tell your friend that Amr is home. And your friend might well ask, how do you know? And in this case, you would say, well, the lights are on at his house. When you tell your friend what you believe and why, you express your inference in two propositions. Amr is home is the conclusion, and the lights are on at his house is the premise. When you express an inference, the proposition that expresses what you are inferring is the conclusion. That is to say, Amr is home. But the proposition that gives the reason we should believe the conclusion is the premise. By itself or with the help of other premises, it should describe the evidence that the conclusion is true. Okay. So if you don't already understand these terms clearly, you're really going to need to understand them clearly and sort of fix the meaning of these terms in your mind, because from here on forward, we're going to use the term premise and conclusion quite a bit. And you're going to need to identify premises and conclusions. That's in any kind of, let's say, text or something spoken that you hear whenever you're analyzing arguments, right? That's going to be crucial. So remember these terms. So the example of the premise here is that the lights are on at Amr's house, right? The premise is the proposition that gives the evidence or reason for believing the conclusion. All right. So an argument is a series of propositions, including exactly one conclusion and at least one premise, where the premise or set of premises is expressed to provide evidence that the conclusion is true. So now, here again, you might be familiar with this term in a sort of usual sense, but it's, let's say in this case, a bit of a technical term. because oftentimes we use argument loosely. Sometimes argument just means a disagreement between two people where they might be yelling at each other. And in fact, there's in this technical sense, there would be no argument at all in such a situation sometimes, right? So if they're just screaming names at each other or something like that, then neither of the two people in such a dispute are giving propositions or expressing propositions which express reasons for believing anything that they say, right? It's simply a fight, right, or a conflict. And so an argument in this sense is not just a conflict, right? Nor is an argument in this sense just a conclusion. This is a mistake that people oftentimes make as well. They mistake the conclusion for the argument. So let's say you are now claiming that Amr is home, but without having given any reason for believing that he's home. Someone might say, oh, well, Joe argued that Amr is home. And it may not be the case that Joe actually argued that Amr is home. It might be that Joe just asserted, right, or claimed that Amr is home without giving any reason to believe that Amr is home. But we see that in the way that we understand this term here. If he hasn't given any reason to believe that Amr is home, he hasn't made any argument that Amr is home, right? So when we ask for an argument, we don't just ask for a fight, right? We don't just ask for someone to express their belief or what they claim to be the case or what they want others to believe. We're asking people to express reasons for believing what they believe or claim to be true, right? So keep this definition of argument in mind, because in many of our upcoming exercises, you're going to be asked to identify arguments and passages. And there are places where it seems like an argument is being made by someone who has written something, and no argument is there at all, right? And also, there are passages which of text, I'm talking about passages of text, which contain arguments, but they also contain other material that's not an argument and not part of the argument. And what you're going to have to do is identify the argument and isolate it or separate it from all the other material which is not an argument, which is merely rhetorical or other kinds of material that don't really participate in the argument, that aren't parts of the argument. Right? And that means that everything that you find that is part of an argument should be one of two types of propositions, right? A conclusion or a premise. Yeah? And if it's not a conclusion or a premise, then it's not part of an argument. Yeah. If there's a conclusion without any premise, there's no argument. Yeah. And if there's no conclusion, in fact, right? It's just a claim. Okay. Because it's not the conclusion of any sort of train or line of thinking, process of thinking. Yeah. On the other hand, if there's no conclusion, then there can't be a premise, because a premise is a proposition which offers reason to believe something else, which would be the conclusion, right? So what we're looking for in any kind of argument, when you look for an argument in a text, first you're going to have to look for any conclusion, and then you're going to have to look for reasons given to believe that conclusion. And if you don't find the latter, there's no argument. Yeah, if you don't find a premise, there's no argument. Okay, so again, an argument is a series of propositions including exactly one conclusion and at least one premise, where the premise or a set of premises, because there can be more than one, and most often there are more than one premise, is expressed to provide evidence that the conclusion is. In this case, our premise was that the lights are on at Amr's house, and our conclusion was that Amr is home, right? And you can see that we have this word therefore in front of the conclusion. We don't have to write that word there, because it would be the conclusion regardless of whether the word is there. It's the conclusion because that's what's intended, and that's the thought that is arrived at from the thought that the lights are on at Amr's house. When we express it in a proposition and when we want to express our thoughts to others, we oftentimes, want to, rightfully so, want to make it clear what the relation between the different propositions or the different ideas we're expressing are, right? What the relation between the different propositions is intended to be. So when something is intended as a conclusion, we're going to use these words that are, we call it, for the sake of having something to call them, indicator words, right? They indicate the logical relation that the proposition has in what's being said. So here the word is therefore, and we know this word therefore is always used as, to convey that what's coming as a kind of a result, right? In this case, a kind of an inferential result. Therefore, Amr is home. Yeah. Now, we're going to explain later, but you probably already see that therefore can mean a result in two senses, right? It's not the case that Amr's home because his lights are on. That's not the reason he's home. That's the reason for believing he's home. So we have two different sorts of results. And sometimes therefore is used for, the other kind of result. It's not an inferential result. Right? So, any case, we'll get to that later. Let that, I guess, be a seed in your mind for later. An argument is supposed to give us good reason to believe its conclusion, right? Obviously, yeah. That's what the aim of an argument is. And this goes along with our general paradigm that we expressed before or explained before, that we at the outset considered thinking or the purpose of thinking to be to arrive at the truth or to ascertain the truth about it. So an argument should give us good reason to believe its conclusion. A good reason to believe a proposition is some fact which indicates that it is true or probably true. That is evidence. So, for example, if your friend asks, why do you think Amr is home? And you say, because I will be sad otherwise, then you have not given evidence, right? You haven't given reason for believing that he's home, but you have given a reason why you think he's home. And we already see that the reason that something is the case, or let's say the reason that you think something is the case, is not always a reason for believing that it's the case. Yeah. And this gets back to what we just talked about previously, that therefore it can be used in these two different ways. Yeah. So, for instance, you might actually use the word in that way. I will be sad if Amr's not home, therefore I think he's home. So in that case, the therefore sort of explains that your thinking he's home is the result of the fact that you would be sad if he was not. Right? So therefore says that a kind of a result is coming, or what I'm about to express is intended to be as a result of the thing that I previously had just described, right? It's not necessarily that the result is that you then have reason to believe something, right? So here we have that, right? You have not given evidence, but you've explained why you think what you think, right? And you may not always think what you think because you have a good reason for thinking so. Okay. To judge whether good evidence has been offered or not, we must ask whether the evidence is factual and whether or not it shows that the conclusion is true. Right? And that means asking two questions about the argument. Are the premises true? And are the premises logically related to the conclusion in the right way? Yeah. Okay. So, right, since our aim is, right, in thinking to ascertain the truth, right, then our aim in making an inference is to make an inference on the basis of good evidence, right? Evidence that shows that the conclusion is true or most likely to be true. Yeah. And so when we do make an inference and then express it in an argument, right? So then what we're evaluating is the argument. We can only evaluate the inference as it's sort of made clear to ourselves by expressing it to ourselves or to others, right? And then we have some language that we have to work with, right? So the inference is viewed through the language, as we had just discussed earlier, the way this astronomer views the stars through the telescope, right? We can only work with the language, what's said, what's written. Yep. So when we're evaluating the arguments here, we have to ask two questions. Are the premises true, right? That because the premises, again, are the propositions that provide the evidence, right? The reason for believing the conclusion, right? But if the premises are not true, then that evidence does not obtain. And, something which is not a fact cannot be actually a reason for believing something else. Yeah. So if they're putting someone on trial for murder and the prosecutor says, well, we found his fingerprints on the weapon, right? The judge can ask the prosecutor, is it true? And the prosecutor says, well, no, we didn't really find his fingerprints on the weapon. Right? Well, then, the non-existent fingerprints, don't constitute evidence for anything. Yeah. So the premises have to be true if the argument is, has any force, has any strength. And it also has to be the case that the premises are logically related to the conclusion in the right way. Yeah. Because of course, the prosecutor could say, well, no, but if his fingerprints were on the weapon, then we would have evidence that he's the criminal. Yeah. And that's true. That means that the premises are logically related to the conclusion in the right way, even though they're not true. Yeah. And that means that there can also be true premises which are not logically related to the conclusion in the right way. So, yeah, the prosecutor could say, Exhibit A, Joe is a murderer, and the evidence we have for that is that it's Wednesday, right? And maybe it's Wednesday, so the premise is true, but there's no logical relation between that true premise and the conclusion. Yeah, those are just ridiculous examples. Obvious examples, but these are the two dimensions, two aspects of an argument that you have to look at and ask about in order to evaluate it effectively. Are the premises true, and are the premises logically related to the conclusion in the right way? And it will be the case for our course that we are going to be talking about two, right? Most of the time here, we're going to be discussing different ways in which a premise can be related to the conclusion, right? In such a way as to give reason for believing the conclusion is true. And there are different ways in which premises can relate to a conclusion. They constitute different sorts of inferences that we will study as we go along. All right, so yeah, here's our example. The lights are on at Amar's house. So Amar is home. Is the premise true? Well, you looked at and you saw the lights on, so we'll say that it's true. Finding out whether the premises are true, of course, requires taking the appropriate steps to investigate it. And this depends on what kind of premise it is, what is about, etc. Here it's fairly simple. You have to open your eyes and look across the street to see if the lights are on. Yeah? And that's how you'll find out whether it's true. Mm-hmm. But normally, the matter is more complicated than that. And this ascertaining whether the premises are true requires more involved methods. And there are a lot of questions to ask about those methods. In classical times, this was incorporated into the study of logic itself. And now we've sort of separated it out into another field called epistemology. And the field of epistemology is simply the field of asking or studying what the sorts of methods, right, are required to ascertain what kind of knowledge, right? So there are different types of objects of knowledge, and they require. Going on to that part then. Are the premises logically related to the conclusion in the right way? Again, the premise is that the lights are on at Amar's house. The conclusion is that Amar is home. And look, we have a new indicator word here, so instead of therefore, right? always have to be aware of the ways in which we use language to indicate these logical relations. So try to practice that when you're reading and going through the exercises. Your friend says, okay, so the lights are on. Well, what does that have to do with whether he's home or not? How does that prove that Elmer's home? Why should I believe that he's home? Simply because his lights are on. Well, what would you say? Perhaps you might say, well, people usually turn off the lights when they leave the house, right? And this proposition logically relates, right? The first premise to the conclusion. In this case, it sort of explains what the relation is between the first premises and the conclusion, right? You're saying, since people usually turn the lights off when they leave home, and his lights are on, I'm then assuming that someone's home, and since it's his house, I'm assuming it's him that's in there, right? It's Amr. And that constitutes an implicit premise, right? So we have the first premise that you expressed, that the lights are on at Amr's house. And we have this other thing which was in the background in your thinking, right? That people usually turn their lights off when they leave home. And that's the thought in the background which you didn't express, which leads you from the first premise to the conclusion that Amr is home. And since you didn't express it, it's an implicit premise, right? Before, you did not express the second premise, but it was part of your inference. You were thinking it, even though you didn't say it. And the reason that you didn't say it is probably because you intuitively thought it was so obvious that it doesn't need to be said. So oftentimes, we leave those things implicit without expressing them, right? But they are actually an essential part of the thought process that leads, in this case, the first premise to the conclusion. And so it's an implicit premise. Now that you've expressed it, we've made it, or now that we have expressed it, we have made it explicit, right? When you express it, you make it explicit. Yeah. So back to the lights are on at Amr's house. People usually turn their lights off when they leave home. So Amr is home. If the second premise is true, does it make the first premise related to the conclusion in the right way so that the first premise is good evidence for C? Well, now we can actually ask that question because we've made it clear to ourselves what we take to be the link between the first premise and the conclusion. That's to say, we've brought the second premise out into the open. And that's one of the very important things about making or let's say identifying the implicit premises in our thinking and then making them explicit, because only then can we actually evaluate our line of thinking. Okay, so we're essentially making clear to ourselves what the whole train of thought is, and what every piece in that train of thought is and the role it plays, so that we can actually evaluate it effectively. And oftentimes we don't really know why we're thinking what we're thinking in a certain sense, because there are implicit premises which we haven't made clear to ourselves. And it's a very interesting thing that we can actually be thinking something without knowing that we're thinking it. But that seems to happen, and we find ourselves in a much better position when we're totally clear to ourselves about what we're thinking. And that's that process. This is a process of making the implicit premises explicit. So as for this question, which we can now answer, are there other questions we need to answer first before we can give a good answer to this? Yeah, perhaps. We might ask whether Amr lives alone or with his family or parents. If Amr lives alone, then the fact that the lights are on at his house, right, is a lot stronger evidence that he's home. Since, as we said, people usually turn their lights off when they leave. But if Amr lives with other people, it may be that those other people are at home and not him. Whereas if he lives alone, of course, the chances are much higher that it's him inside the house or that he is inside the house. You could also ask questions about Amr. Is he environmentally conscious or a wasteful person? So he might be the type of person who just leaves the lights on in his house whenever he leaves because he doesn't really care about the environment or conserving energy, and he doesn't really worry about how much he's going to pay for his electrical bill or anything like that. If he's that kind of person, then the evidence is weaker. The fact that the lights are on at his house is much weaker reason to believe that he's at home. All right, so those are just examples of different of the path that you have to take in order to actually evaluate the argument that's being made. Questions you have to ask about the context, specific things, for example, about Amr and so forth. And each different situation will present you with different sorts of considerations, and it's not possible to sort of catalog all of them. You have to take it on a case-by-case basis and learn from example, practice. Okay, so that's why we have exercises. Right, and these exercises you're going to be given a number of passages, and you're going to be asked to identify and analyze the arguments in the passage. Basically, it's identify whether there's an argument there, and then show what the argument is, which basically means, telling us what the premises and the conclusion are, right? Because an argument has to have premise and a conclusion, at least one premise and then a conclusion. Yeah. Now, something I kind of missed before, which I need to clarify here. Every argument has exactly one conclusion, okay? If you think an argument has two conclusions, that means you actually have two arguments. Yeah. So if you do have two conclusions, then you should have premises for each of those conclusions, because without premises, it's not really a conclusion, right? So you could have two conclusions with the same premise, right? So one fact can be a reason to believe two different things. Yeah. For example, the fact that the lights are on at Amr's house might be a reason to believe that Amr is home. And it's certainly a reason to believe that electricity is running in the house, right? Something like that there's a light bulb in the house, right? So there's so many different things that, you can infer from a single fact. So that means one premise, again, can have a number of different conclusions. In each case, you have a different argument, even though it's the same premise. So there's one conclusion per argument, right? One argument per conclusion, sorry. If you find that in a passage where there's a number of different conclusions, you actually have a number of different arguments. And sometimes the conclusion of an argument can be a premise for another argument, and that often is the case, but you still have more than one argument. Okay? We're not going to get to that sort of case until a little later. And remember, one premise is one proposition, one subject and one predicate term, and the same goes for one conclusion. A conclusion is a proposition, and a premise is a proposition. Yeah? Don't find anything that's not a proposition and you think that it's a premise. There's no way that it could be a premise, because a premise gives reason for believing something, and the reason for believing something is the fact that a certain thing is a case. It's a fact, right? So it requires a sentence which describes how things are, which is a proposition. Yeah? So that's why we look for propositions in the previous exercises. And now that you're used to identifying propositions, which is simple and easy, you're more in a better position now to identify arguments and analyze arguments and passages. Okay? So these are the three things you got to remember. So in any case, what you're going to do, you take the passage, you read it. The best thing to do is look for indicator words that we have talked about, like therefore and so and thus and because and it follows or consequently, that these words are telling me that The relation between reasons and things for which they are reasons. Yeah. Look for indicator terms in the passages, and then look for the conclusion. When you find a conclusion, you know you have an argument. Then look for the propositions which express reasons to believe that conclusion, and then you know you have the premises. So then you list them in that order. You list the premises and the conclusion at the bottom, just like we did here, right? Premise 1, the lights are on at Amar's house. Premise 2, people usually turn their lights off when they leave home. C, which of course stands for conclusion, Amar is home. Okay? You do it like that, it'll be clear what the argument is. Yeah, because the argument is, of course, the entire set of propositions, the conclusion and the premises, right? And the premises that are related to the conclusion. And sort of realize the logical relations that exist between those propositions. And it's only then that you can see the argument, right? So you have to start with a bit of opening your mind here for it. And then once you do that, the rest is mechanical, right? So you're going to list the premises, yeah, and the conclusion. Now, it doesn't matter whether, here where we numbered them 1, 2, 3, it doesn't matter what order you list the premises in. For the purposes of the exercise, all you need to do is put them before the conclusion and clearly mark the conclusion as conclusion, right? So we're doing it this way. We need to isolate each premise separately from the others. And later, we're going to need to be able to refer to each premise, right, independently. And so that's why we give it a number. So we need to say premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, so forth, right? And we need to clearly indicate the conclusion as distinct from the premises. So we have just we just have the simple system to do that. And the reason I'm asking you to do the exercise in this way is so that I can evaluate whether you understand what's what. So if there's not a standard way for you to identify to me or to express to me what you identify as a premise and a conclusion, then there's no way that I can know that you've done that. Right? So I'm talking to people who like to do their homework in kind of messy ways without following instructions that, actually the instructions are essential to follow simply so that we communicate with each other. You might actually be right, but you might not be effectively communicating to me that you understand it. And that's why we have this procedure for, listing the premises. So for that reason, we have a standard form, right? We list the premises before the conclusion, right? But what I am telling you is that among the premises, it doesn't matter which order you list them. So, of course, it doesn't matter whether I say the elephant's brain weighs 2,500 grams first, and then later tell you that the human brain weighs 1,500 grams. It doesn't matter which order those come in, right? What matters is that you distinguish between the premise and the conclusion. Now, when we're discussing an argument, if you're discussing an argument that you've already analyzed with someone else, then everybody needs to be on the same page about what we mean by premise 1 and what we mean by premise 2, but this is just about effective communication. Yeah? Okay. And that's important. Effective communication is essential for at least a sort of collaborative, collective critical thinking, because people need to be able to communicate with each other to collaboratively deliberate on things. And that's it. So go find your exercises and enjoy. And I think that you will find it. I think you'll find it enjoyable once you do it. And I hope that after you do these exercises, you should start reading things more closely and looking for these kinds of relations, because these logical relations, yeah. Because this really does make the difference between writing and communication, which is intelligent and appeals to the intelligence of people, and a kind of writing and communication which really is not intelligent, let's say, and appeals to the more pathological elements of people, or we can say the less human, well, they're all human elements of people, but let's say less uniquely human, right? Less Yeah. Less exalted than reason. Yeah. Okay.